3 minutes after 10 is the time. What is the relationship between your radio listening and the weather? I honestly don't know. I can't remember. It's so rarely this hot. Everyone's going 33 degrees. People say it's hotter than the Maldives. Is that why the Maldives is trending? Or is there another reason why the Maldives is trending? It's hotter than the Maldives. Needless to say, I packed my summer wardrobe for a trip to Dublin later today, only to check the weather forecast on the way into... When I say my summer wardrobe, I bought 2 new shirts in Marks and Spencer's yesterday. I've reached the stage in my life where Marks and Spencer's is often the answer to my sartorial quests. I never thought that day would dawn. I remember the first time Mrs. O'Brien bought me some clothes from Marks and Spencer's, and I thought I thought one of us might be contemplating divorce. I just wasn't sure which one. But yesterday, I walked up and down Regent Street in London's fashionable West End. I saw one shirt I quite liked in the window of an Italian outfitter, and I went in and tried it on, and then I realised there were no prices on it. And I think there's an old adage, isn't there, that if you have to ask how much something costs, you can't afford it. How much do you think they were asking for one linen shirt, one quite nice linen shirt in an Italian shop yesterday? Do you want to have a guess? How much? Go on, £190 for one shirt, for one linen shirt. And that won't even be the most expensive one probably in that shop, let alone in London. And I just balked at it. I just thought, look, if I was going to a wedding, i.e. my own, then I might contemplate dropping that sort of cash on a shirt. But my goodness me, just for what I presumed was going to be an extremely hot weekend in Dorking by the sea, just outside Dublin, I thought, no. So where do you go? Answer Marks and Spencer. Do you think they'd sponsor me? Do you think I could get a sponsor? I promise, I'm such a scruffy git. Who on earth would want to be associated with my sartorial choices? I put... what are they called, these sort of shirts? Polo shirt. I put a polo shirt on this morning, and then I caught myself in the reflection at the tube station, and it's got a flipping stain on it. And that's after it's been washed. So I must have spilt coffee on it or something like that last time I wore it. So I ended up in Marks and Spencer's and bought a couple of rather nice shirts that fit. And rather winningly, they don't have any insignia on them. The thing I've got on now, which I got in TK Maxx before anyone accuses me of elitism, metropolitan liberal elitism, has got one of those little polo players on it, which is associated with a well-known American brand. I don't mind that because it's quite subtle, and when I was a kid it was still quite cool, but I try to find clothes that don't have insignia on them. I don't even little insignia, and it's almost impossible to do. Marks and Spencer's is usually quite reliable in that field, although I've noticed now they've started sticking a big St. Michael across some of their brands. Anyway, what was I talking about that for? Oh yes, I think we're already establishing the relationship between heat and the radio, aren't we? This is even more jabbery than usual on the programme. So I packed my summer wardrobe, like my 2 new shirts, and then checked the weather forecast for Dublin on the way into work today with my summer wardrobe nestling between my knees in my carry-on luggage. It's going to be absolutely weeing it down when I get there, and 9 degrees on Saturday and Sunday. So I'm going to be walking around looking like the man from Del Monte in monsoon weather or hurricane style, or at least in extremely cold weather. So, yeah, if you do bump into me, I'll possibly be grateful for a V-neck sweater and an umbrella. Anyway, 6 minutes after 10 is the time. I only ask what the relationship is between the weather, between the heat and the... Don't send me messages like that while I'm just limbering up to do my very important monologue. That's what we should start calling it. Should we start calling it that every morning? It's time for the very important monologue. Stephen saying Chris Moyles does often say that he mistakes you for a homeless man when he bumps into you outside the Leicester Square studio. What's making me laugh about that is that it's not entirely true. I don't think he actually mistake. But I tell you what, I don't know if you've ever heard of Chris Moyles or caught him on the radio, but he's not exactly backwards in coming forwards, and he has made that opinion clear to me on a number of occasions, Stephen. Thank you. The reason I ask what the relationship is between the weather and the radio is because I think I'm setting the bar quite high this morning. And if you're feeling all hot and sweaty, you're going to have your wits about you to join in. What I mean by that is it's highly likely that the only one of us enjoying the benefits of a state-of-the-art air conditioning system at this point in our conversation is me. And you might not fancy ringing in on a heavy-duty subject. But that is the risk I take every day. Somebody get James an ice cream? He's clearly overheating, right, Andy? I'm not. I'm probably a bit demob happy. Going back to the old country later, even if the weather is going to be a personal affront to my wardrobe choices. So there's going to be a strike on Tuesday, and I'm going to tell you straight, it's an absolute bloody nightmare. I mean, if it is anywhere near as well, I would say widespread. The strikers, the unions, I think, would say successful. If it is anywhere near as widespread as the organisers hope, and there's no reason to expect that it won't be, then it is going to be an absolute nightmare. And it would be so easy. It would be so easy to rail against it without really stopping to think or working out the bigger picture or what is really going on. I should stress that it would also be possible to rail against it after you've done all of those things. I've said to you a million times that if you support every strike, you're an idiot. And if you support no strikes at all, you're an idiot. Some of them are bound to be justified, just as some of them are bound to be excessive. So the trick is, of course, to do all your thinking before you nail your colours to a particular mast, to really work things out. But that seems to me to be desperately unfashionable. I broadly lean towards support for the RMT for one very simple reason. Their workers, almost uniquely, it would sometimes seem, among the workforce of the United Kingdom, enjoy the sort of terms and conditions that everybody should enjoy. I think the nastiest argument I hear in the context of rail workers taking industrial action is people complaining that they earn more than nurses without realising that that is a damning indictment of how little nurses earn, not a zinging critique of how much railway workers earn. And it's also popular in the unthinking Rupert Murdoch-flavoured corners of the British media to pretend that this is all about train drivers, some of whom earn what, well, no Rupert Murdoch columnist would get out of bed for, but which they consider to be far too much money for ordinary members of the working class, who they pretend to care about and champion whenever they're trying to introduce racist bile into public discourse. So most of the people striking, and most of the strike, is built upon a threat to the terms and conditions of railway workers from people who clean the toilets on station platforms right up to train drivers and everybody in between, platform workers, station workers, everybody in between. And what I think they are protesting against and striking against is what most industrial action is designed to do, and that is to protect the terms and conditions that they currently enjoy and to secure a pay rise that would allow their workers to cope better with the economic assaults that have been caused in part, but not entirely, by 12 years of Tory rule. So you would be foolish to support all strikes, and you would be foolish, I think, to support no strikes. I made a little promise to myself a few months ago that I'd stop calling people idiots unless they really deserved it. I've called everyone an idiot today, in a way. So let's scratch the bit when I said you're an idiot if you support all strikes and an idiot if you support no strikes, and change it instead to foolish. It would be foolish to support every single strike that's ever called, just as it would be foolish to support no strikes whatsoever. We are, of course, going to talk about this strike. I don't expect you to get the violins out at this point, but for the first time I can remember, actually, I took the boss to one side the other day and said, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to get in and out of work on Tuesday. Obviously, the immediate response is to book me a car, which, as you will know if you listen to the programme closely, I used to do every day, but now for environmental reasons, brackets, being bullied by my own children, close brackets, I no longer do that. But I don't know whether you're aware of this, contract hire vehicles in London coming in from out west are not reliable post-pandemic. I don't know why. I've taken a view that it's about as interesting to the average listener as conversations about cycle lanes or electric scooters, so we haven't discussed it on the programme, but quite why even Uber is nowhere near as reliable, I'm told, as it was before the pandemic. I don't know. I presume, as with many other things, it's a shortage of bodies, it's a shortage of people. But I am worried that even with a car booked by one of the biggest broadcasting behemoths in the country, I'm talking about the business I work for, not about myself, although I guess if the cap fits, I'm worried it might not turn up, because I don't have the sort of job where you can be 10 minutes late. I don't know what would happen, frankly. I suspect Nick would probably work to rule. He wouldn't speak once 10 o'clock had come round. What would happen? Keith might slide into the studio, start spinning some of the discs that he is famous for spinning in some corners of the southeast. What would happen if I was? Would they play a tape of Steve Allen? And also, you worry there might be some sort of coup What if someone slid into the studio for 10 minutes before I got here because I'd been delayed by industrial action and they were better than me? That would be awful for everyone. Well, I suppose it'd be good for everybody except me, but it would be awful for me. So I can't run the risk of not being here in time. And I don't really want to stay over on Monday night. That would be a little bit weird. And I like my family, and I'm away all weekend. So I look, and I had something in the diary for work after the radio show, and I had quite an important meeting over dinner booked later in the evening, and that's been postponed, and it's important enough and high-powered enough that I don't know if the people involved will be able to reschedule it at a time that is convenient for me. So a potentially exciting project may slip over the horizon, and I was, do you know what I was thinking of doing? I shouldn't have built that up in quite the style that I did. It's not that interesting, actually. No, I'm not going to walk. I've walked home before. I walked home quite often during lockdown, but if it's hot, it's a killer. I thought I'd get the pleasure boat from Westminster Pier to Kew Bridge. I did it the other day. It's an absolute joy. It's a little bit expensive to be doing it every day instead of taking the tube, but if the tides are on my side, if the tide is high, what's the next line? I'll be holding on. I'll be making my way to Kew Bridge on the pleasure boat. If the tide... No, I haven't got the kit in the shed anymore. All of you suggesting that I could phone it in, unless that's a figure of speech. It's 10:15 already. God knows what I'm supposed to be talking about this morning. But well, clearly it's the strikes, isn't it? And also some shirts that I bought yesterday, apparently. The strikes question I've got for you is this. Do you remember when P&Q fired their entire workforce and replaced them with agency staff? And briefly, the political establishment, and indeed most media, I think, although I'd have to double check, and frankly life's too short, the political establishment and most media were united in their condemnation of P&O. And then and there were threats. Grant Shapps was going to do such things. What they were, he knew not, but they would be the terror of the earth. Grant Shapps absolutely adamant and that this was an outrage and that they were thinking of changing the law to prevent it from happening again, and that it was an assault upon the dignity of the British workforce, ordinary British working people who they always stick up for. You remember that? And then it sort of just went away again. And P&O's ships, as far as I'm aware, are now crewed by agency staff who were brought in to replace people on the payroll. Now, they had a decent-ish remuneration package, compensation package, the people that were got rid of, but they didn't want to be got rid of. And the political and media establishment united to condemn those moves, which makes it all the stranger that yesterday Grant Shapps insisted that ministers will put agency workers on the railways if strikes persist. So I think this works. P&O workers didn't have the opportunity to take industrial action to protest against having their terms and conditions torn up and thrown into the River Humber because they were blindsided and taken by surprise. And Grant Shapps was on their side, briefly. But railway workers who are concerned about an assault upon their terms and conditions and are keen to protect their pay packets, they're going to be replaced by agency workers, says the same Grant Shapps. And unfortunately for Grant, at this stage in his career, he can't use made-up names to flog dodgy get-rich-quick schemes on the internet. He has to call himself Grant Shapps every day. He can't be Sebastian Fox on Fridays, Grant Shapps on Mondays, and Michael Green on Wednesdays, which is, seriously, you think I'm exaggerating? That's how he spent a significant part of his pre- and indeed post-political career. I can't quite get my head around that. How can bringing in agency workers to replace P&O staff be an appalling affront to the dignity of British workers in the mind of someone who's threatening to bring in agency staff to replace British workers on the railways who have the audacity to suggest that they're going to take collective action to protect themselves from what they describe, and we'll examine this morning whether or not this description is fair or accurate or neither, they describe as an unconscionable assault upon their terms and conditions. And here's the bit I really don't get, and I suspect that my privilege is part of the problem here. The bit I really don't get is the envy. How you can be so easily persuaded to hate on someone protecting their terms and conditions because their terms and conditions are better than yours, instead of hating whatever it was that took yours away, and not just diminished your terms and conditions, but also diminished your ability to protest against that diminishment. In other words, the post-1979 settlement that stripped trade unions bare in almost all sectors, and the ones that still offer a degree of support to their members are public enemy number one in the Daily Mail and the Rupert Murdoch-owned media. And it's lazy and it's gross, because what is left if you have no protection? 0-hour contracts. That's what's left. Ghost economies where you only get to work after turning up if they need you, where they send you home if they don't need you, where you have to put your hand up to ask for permission to go to the toilet, where you don't know from 1 week to the next whether you're going to have a job next month. That is what these people dream of. I'm not making that up. Dominic Raab and Priti Patel and Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and Chris Skidmore wrote a bloody book about it. That is what they dream of. So here's the question for you this morning. You can either do it from the outside, trying to analyse other people, or you can do it from the inside, telling me why you are part of this problem. How come it is so easy to persuade working British people to attack other working British people when they decide to stick up for themselves? And obviously the only way in which they can stick up for themselves meaningfully is by inconveniencing the rest of us. I'm very conscious of my age this morning, because I used to say on the radio I might need people who are older than me to explain this. But I'm 50 now, and obviously there are still an awful lot of people older than me, but not as many as there were when I started in this job all those moons ago. But I don't have the palette of memory to remember whether or not this is a relatively new phenomenon, whether or not actually in the 1950s and the 1960s industrial action was widely understood to be a last resort for workers against the owning classes. I don't know, but that's the question I've got for you. Why is it so easy in 21st century Britain to turn worker against worker when the worker who still has the right to protect him or herself from an employer dares to exercise it? Why aren't we all on the same side? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And that, I think, is one of the most important questions that society ever asks itself. And I can't imagine things being much uglier on this particular issue than they are in the society we inhabit. Because if they can turn you against railway workers, they can turn you against doctors. How do I know that? Because they already did. 23 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And some of the classic perennial recommendations already coming in. For blinding clarity, says Brendan, everyone should read Robert Tressel's Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists. It will change minds. You're right, but it's been around for a while. There's a rather beautiful graphic novel version of it as well by two sisters that I got stuck into last year, which is a beautiful little edition. And this quote, this beautiful quote from Alan. And Ira Bevan, perhaps inevitably. How can wealth persuade poverty to use its political freedom to keep wealth in power? Here lies the whole art of conservative politics in the 20th century. And I would add to that, that is the principle at the very heart of persuading working people to attack working people when those working people seek to protect themselves from employers in a way that the working people attacking them can't. I'm not going to lie, that probably needs a little bit of work when it comes to pithiness. Nicholas is in Bexley Heath. Nicholas, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, morning, James. The tiniest, briefest of histories, before 1994, everyone was paid the same. Post-97, the railway was privatised and every individual company had to one-up each other on pay in order to avoid training people up. So the cost of training drivers from the bottom was so expensive, they decided that it was cheaper to just poach from one another.
So as a consequence of privatisation, then, because if you're going to spend money on training, that's coming out of the profits, and it would be cheaper to pay drivers more than it would be to train up the next generation of drivers.
That's absolutely right. And we're in that situation where in 2016, Govia, for example, were attempting to train 180 or something drivers, and they couldn't do it, which led to mass carnage when the Thameslink brand first started at Cambridge and Peterborough in 2016.
As in unstaffed trains and cancelled services.
It was bedlam. Saturdays.
But they must be training some drivers, otherwise the trains would have ground to a halt
And therein
Last
lies
week.
what happened. The government effectively selected certain companies to become the training schools, whilst
Right.
allowing others, like your Avanti West Coast and your cross countries, to do nothing. But now even they, after the pandemic, have to start training. But of course, the critical thing is that train drivers are not going on strike.
Some are, I
The
think,
train
aren't
drivers
they?
are part of-
ASLEF have balloted, but of course the RMT that generally doesn't represent train drivers. That is
Yeah,
a
so
miss.
the RMT is your. It could be. I mean, the dreadful state of the railway system at the moment, in terms of you have agency staff regularly manning ticket barriers at major stations. You have different subcontractors doing the trains cleaning. The maintenance is often now taken outside of house, and people don't realise how expensive it is for a company to lease a train, because no companies own their own trains, in order to, because people like your Siemens and your Bombardiers are offering, a bit like when you buy a car and you get a service agreement. So you then get 5 years of tech support. So now depots are not being run by train companies, they're being run by
train builders.
maintenance and builders, yeah. So the system is so incredibly fragmented, and of course that creates...
And
your
short-termist as well. That seems to me to be the problem that you describe.
Look what's happening at the moment now. I mean, you live sort of in Kew, so on South West Trains at the moment, they're sticking something like 70 trains into store.
I don't actually live in Kew. That's just where the boat stops. I'll have to walk home from there. But yeah, we digress slightly. I don't want anyone making a pilgrimage to Kew in the hope of bumping into me, Nicholas.
Well, and you won't be able to get a train there because all the trains are cancelled.
Yes, exactly,
so don't do it.
Yes.
Get the boat. But
no, I will.
In terms of why people are maybe attacking each other, well, I think me and you probably know why.
No, I don't. Well, I do and I don't. You tell me, because you sound. Let me speculate that you have a history of working on the trains, and you therefore understand the importance of trade unions.
Well, yes, and of course, the skilled nature of the job is something that people don't want to admit, because to get into that job it's only 2% of people from application will get to work in the job because of the rigour of the job and the training. So a lot of it, I think, is driven by a bit of jealousy, and even if it's not,
how does that work, though? I mean, I never forget, and I've told this story a few times. I never forget when I doing a paper review, I think at Sky News, and somebody said something along the lines of, I think we were talking about pensions, and somebody said something, well, most people don't have a pension as good as this, so why on earth are they insisting on keeping theirs? It's probably about the firefighters, would it, in that context? I forget precisely.
Firefighters, military, railways have still got good pensions.
And no one has yet persuaded me that is not the rhetorical equivalent of saying that I got mugged last night and therefore I won't be happy today until everyone else has been mugged as well.
That's my argument is very similar. You know, I've been beaten up, and I'm not going to be happy until everyone else in this nightclub has been punched in the face.
Yes.
But I think it's also a bit like the people at the top, the people who own the media companies, the people who are in charge, the extremely rich, are dining on beef Wellington on a dining table, and here we all are underneath fighting over scraps. And so long as they can convince you that the person next to you on the floor is about to have your scrap, you're going to fight each other.
I mean, that works with immigration. Does that work with this?
Of course it does.
Well, hang on. Here's a fictional mug, victim, call it what you will. And he is now being told this morning that he's got to be opposed to the industrial action on the railways, being taken to protest or resist mooted job losses and to secure an above-inflation pay rise. And I'm pointing out that some of these people already earn more than nurses do. That's not my scraps being taken. Do you see what I mean? That's something more subtle going on there. Why did he not just turn around and say, well, it's thanks to vampires like you and your sponsors, your billionaire owners, that nurses don't get paid more. It's thanks to 12 years of Tory rule that nurses don't get paid more. So why am I doing the dirty work for the people who've chosen to pay nurses a pittance as a punter objecting to railway workers trying to get themselves or keep a good deal?
I can only begin to speculate on some of the various reasons as to why. I mean, it could be anything from the fact that the people who have large media companies are extremely rich, probably have interests in other things like commercial property, for example, which I know you've spoken about before. Yeah. So you need people to keep going to work, and you need hospitals to potentially still be run down so that you can potentially profiteer off.
Also, they get. I mean, they're also looking at the trade unions in their own industries. The more powerful a trade union is, the less money they get to keep themselves from the profit.
Absolutely.
The more, and obviously there were some some poor practices in place during the print disputes or prior to the print disputes, but the idea that you would dispense with it altogether is so self-defeating for the workforce. And we're not going to get all the answers in the first call of the day, Nicholas, but we've certainly got some food for thought. And I'm conscious of not alienating you. If you have fallen perhaps today already for that nurses earn less than some railway workers, therefore I'm opposed to railway workers taking industrial action, and listening to Nicholas explain it, and possibly even myself, you've suddenly sort of gone, crikey, I can't believe I fell down that particular hole. Crikey, who tripped me up like that? Who slapped me around the face with a wet fish and got me to act against my own interests while using my political freedom to keep wealth in power? Just talk me through those impulses and through those sort of thought processes. I'm absolutely furious with railway workers because they're really messing up my day. That needs no explaining. I get that. All right? They're messing up my day. I'm absolutely furious with them because they're trying to protect their terms and conditions, which in some cases will already be better than nurses, who I really, really care about, up to the point where they threaten to take some sort of industrial action in the hope of improving their terms and conditions, in which case the same people in the media turning me against railway workers today will be turning me against nurses or, as was most recent the case, junior doctors. It's so blooming obvious, isn't it, when you talk it through? I wonder why so few people talk it through. Holly Harris is here now with your headlines. 10:35 is the time. Do you know, I have never heard this before, but I wonder if it is relevant to the conversation we're having about the strikes that are coming on Tuesday. A genie offers to grant one wish to a peasant. He begins wondering what treasures he should request. Then the genie explains that whatever the peasant wishes for and receives himself, his neighbour will receive double. So the peasant says, OK then, I want you to poke out one of my eyes. The only word I'd change in that is peasant. I don't think it needs to be a peasant. I presume that's because it has its origins in folklore or something like that. But I think that would apply to the cabinet, wouldn't it, at the moment? You can have whatever you want, riches beyond your wildest dreams, but Govey will get double. All right, then poke out one of my eyes. Brutal. But is it that simple? Are we back to psychology? Are we back to, like, when we talk about Rwandan deportations, recognising everybody knows it's awful, but some people like the idea of other people being hurt, and they don't even have to be foreign. They could just be railway workers. What is it? Is it that? Is it just am I going to talk myself out of a job? Is it some sort of primeval, unpleasant impulse, some evolutionary mechanism that makes some people actively enjoy the misfortune of others, and others feel empathy and worry about it? Not saying anyone's better or worse, because you don't have any control over that. It's almost like the colour of your eyes or the size of your feet. There's someone over there getting rinsed. I love it. Yeah, I love it when people are rinsed, especially if they are, and then insert your prejudice of choice. There's someone over there getting rinsed. That's awful. We should do everything we can to stop it, shouldn't we? Right. Foot size and eye colour. I don't know. 10:36 is the time. There is another word in that old little proverb there that I should change as well. I presume because of predictive text, it actually read like this when you sent it in. A genie offers to grant one wish to a peasant. He begins wondering what treasures he should request. Then the fish explains that whatever the peasant wishes for and receives himself, his neighbour will receive double. So the peasant says, OK, then I want you to poke out one of my eyes. I read that 4 times before I realised that there is no fish in the story, and it must just be a mistake on the predictive text, and it should have been a repetition of genie. There's no fish in that tale. No fish at all. I don't know why the image of Nigel Farage just popped into my head then when I said the word fish 3 times in 10 seconds. Terry's in Birmingham to take us back to the strike. Terry, what's going on?
Good morning. It's beautiful, sunny in Birmingham. So
Splendid.
This is the thing. We've arrived.
The Venice of the Midlands.
The Venice of Birmingham with the canals. So we've arrived at a really interesting point in time from society's point of view.
Yes.
In that, when somebody decides to take last resort action of removing their labour in a dispute over conditions and pay, we then start turning around and say, "Oh, they get paid more than nurses."
Yeah.
Or they get paid more than junior doctors. Do you realise they only work 36 hours a week, whereas this person over here is earning 70 hours a week? The problem is not what their terms and conditions are as rail workers. The problem is the terms and conditions of wages of the other people.
Yes.
And we need to uplift everybody. But
no one's coming to uplift me, so why should they have it then?
Well, because we've got people, multimillionaire heads of the Bank of England, telling everybody from his multimillionaire position, you don't need a pay rise, you shouldn't ask for a pay rise. My mum doesn't sit at home wondering whether she can put the heating on or not. So why does your mum, who can't afford to put the heating on, why do you need more money? And for me, I personally don't think P&O, for instance, look what happened with P&O, where they sacked everybody who was on good terms and conditions.
Yes, and then all these people, and then all of these people, from Grant Shapps, Michael Green, and Sebastian Fox down, all came out to condemn that for 10 minutes.
Every single one of them. So for me,
is that as hypocritical as I think it is, as I suggested it was at the top of the show this morning? It's utterly hypocritical.
Of course it is, because born in the 1960s and in a youth in the 1970s, I remember the strikes with the coal miners down at Saltley Gate in Birmingham, where the police turned up, mob-handed, and literally beat them into submission because they were withholding their labour. Now, you could look at that and say, well, actually, they were very powerful. The person in charge, Arthur Scargill, was off on a rogue mission, but they were still fighting over terms and conditions. And terms and conditions and freedoms are very rarely given. They're almost exclusively always have to be taken.
That's a very good point.
And then, like I said, it goes back to Iron Bevan in the 1800s. Women were fighting to get the right to vote.
I see what you mean. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, it's Wilthorne. Yeah. So they were fighting to get the right to vote, and people really don't understand or remember that was only less than 100 years ago.
I'm with you on all of that, except the bit about how easy it is, about how easy it is for a Daily Mail. I mean, you've got the Daily Mail columnist Richard Littlejohn writes his pieces about why everyone has to return to work and stop working from home, from his home in Florida. So,
of course.
and the equivalent of, I mean, it's just unbelievable. But the equivalent of that is all of these people on several $100,000 a year constructing arguments based upon the fact that some railway workers get paid too much. In this context, chiefly ones that aren't actually going on strike or certainly aren't leading the strike action in the case of drivers. And after 12 years of Tory rule, nurses are getting paid so little that railway workers shouldn't go on strike to secure a pay rise. I don't get it, Terry.
So why do we all need to go back to the office? We all need to go back to the office because all of the big office buildings that were built in London...
No, I know all that. I'm not completely stupid. No, I know. We're going to run out of time. I know that bit. I'm not completely stupid. It's the ease with which people accept the invitation to hate on their neighbour.
I think it comes back to the 1980s with Thatcherism and the arrival of Thatcherism when she encouraged the majority of the working classes to exercise the right to buy, whether that was through going and buying a house, going and optioning on your council property.
Right.
But it meant those people were more likely to vote Conservative. It meant those people were more likely to work because you've got to pay a mortgage and you've got to pay your bills. And
that's in retreat now. I'm sorry to be such a pedant, but home ownership. We're looking at generations. Well, I suppose they're not. They haven't made their political presence felt yet. So it's almost like an illusion or a tiny slice of being in the owning classes, and therefore you think that the interests of the billionaire are aligned with yours. But you're also a worker. You're still a worker. You're not sitting there living off your dividends and your shares.
Because you've got to live somewhere. And the children, my kids have turned their back on home ownership because they said, we can't afford it.
I know.
We can't afford to come in at 200,000, 300,000. But that's where it started. And it's come all the way to the present date. And the only way that I can explain it's almost a spitefulness and a lack of ambition is consumerism.
Okay, no, you're a thoughtful man.
The trainers,
yes. Well, then we're not going to worry about our... It doesn't solve all of my problems, although it'd be a bloody miracle if you could. That's what my therapist is for. But it certainly solves some of them. The only thing I'm uncomfortable with, and this isn't what drove your analysis, is this sense that you just end up portraying people who you disagree with as being psychologically different and you would think inferior, but they probably think that we're inferior. Look at those idiots over there sticking up for railway workers when they could be, I don't know, benefiting from something. Or I don't get it. It's a little bit reductive. I think that's the correct word philosophically. It just brings it down to brass tacks, but maybe it is about brass tacks. A few people asking at 10:43, And so I shall tell you, yes, I will talk about Julian Assange in the next hour, but I have a slightly shameful confession to make before we do that. So make sure you stick around if you enjoy shameful confessions. And remember, I was raised a Catholic, so when it comes to shameful confessions, I know what I'm talking about. Barry is from Terry to Barry, from Birmingham to Nottingham. Barry, what would you like to say about this?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
I was in the print industry from the late 50s till I retired.
Right.
So over the years, I was involved in lots of strikes, disputes. Printing industry had a particular notorious
yes, it did.
claim to being
Brenda Dean.
militant.
What was the print union called? Sogat, was it?
Well, that was that they were semi-skilled workers. It was the print industry.
I'm very
then
young,
was broken
Barry.
up into about.
I'm
yeah,
very,
you are.
Yeah.
You are. The print industry then was broken up into about 4 or 5 trade
Right,
unions.
Yes.
You had the Litho Artists, a union called
Okay.
Slade,
Yeah.
which were more militant than us, But it's like all this, we were out on strike once or twice. People went by on the buses and the cars shouting, "Get back to work, you're being greedy," etc. But it's like all disputes, every single dispute, most people aren't aware of the full facts. They'll just read a headline in the paper, hear it on the television, they'll say, "Oh, yeah, they earn 60, 70 grand a year, why are they doing that?" And base their argument on that.
But let me pause you there.
You're probably as guilty of it as anybody else.
Oh, I'm sure I am. I certainly have
you
been.
will pick out arguments to suit you on the day.
No, but why shouldn't they earn 60 or 70 grand? That's the bit I don't get. Why shouldn't they? Just because I don't, why would I not want you to?
Well, I don't think anybody's disputing that, are they? All people are doing is drawing comparisons to what other people earn less than them.
But it's chicken and egg. Surely the desire to hate on the railway workers is there before some idiot comes along and says, "Oh, some of them get paid more than nurses." Surely it's that you're feeding an appetite that already exists. The appetite is not created by the ludicrous comparison.
Well, that's a degree of human nature, isn't it?
Is it, though?
Unfortunately.
Is it? It is just that one about the peasant asking the genie to poke out one of his eyes. We're back to that kind of theory.
More or less.
I hope not.
Yeah.
I mean, and I guess that's why Tony Benn comes in with his constant reminder that it's not about winning. It's just about constantly resisting the opposing forces. And if you don't take strikes, if you don't defend industrial action, if you don't support workers in different sectors, then eventually the owning classes will subsume everything and we'll be back to a sort of 18th century model of economics, or a Victorian model of economics, which people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are too stupid to realise they shouldn't say out loud or write books about how that would actually be a good thing. They're supposed to keep it secret. 10:46 is the time. Julian Assange after 11. Priti Patel has signed extradition papers for Julian Assange to be extradited to America, where he is wanted for espionage charges. My shameful confession about this story on the way as well. It's 10:46. 10:50 is the time. So, listen, if I promise to be nice, would you tell me why you don't like or don't support other workers going on strike? And most obviously it would be railway workers, but I presume you also felt that way about firefighters or about junior doctors or about pretty much anybody, probably the miners, if we go back far enough. What is it? I mean, if you're honest in your heart of hearts, is it because they still have powers that you don't have in your workplace? Is it because you think that people should be grateful for whatever they earn because bosses should be treated like lords and masters? In fact, you may believe that bosses are lords and masters and we should all doff our caps and tug our forelocks and be grateful for whatever may fall from their table. That's a widespread view. I probably shouldn't typify it quite so curtly, but there are lots and lots of people around who think that you should only have to pay workers as little as you can get away with, and that if you don't like it, go and find something else to do. In fact, that's probably Tory ideology, isn't it? So, minimum wage legislation is furiously resisted because businesses won't be able to cope until a progressive government, either Conservative or Labour, brings it in or enhances it, and it turns out businesses can cope. But my God, they didn't want to because it sees more money than is absolutely necessary making its way into the pockets of people. The ideal workforce is one step away from starvation, I imagine. They're so terrified of starving that they'll take whatever you give them to avoid starving, unless, of course, you're rich, in which case you need to be paid ever more money to do the job. But the way to really get your workforce focused if they're poor is to make them even poorer, so they're even more desperate for whatever employment you can provide and whatever pittance you can pay, which is, your shareholders' dream. This isn't communism or Marxism. It's just a recognition of checks and balances. So you go out there, you set up a business, you want to make as much money as you humanly can. I'm in government. I'm like the referee. I'm just making sure that your profits, your rewards, your wealth is not responsible for unconscionable and unacceptable conditions further down the food chain, i.e. with the workforce. So the people who have made you rich shouldn't starve to death if they break their leg, as would have happened in previous eras. The people who have made you rich, the people who sweat, and we're not even bringing slavery into this because, of course, they wouldn't get paid at all, but the people who sweat and toil has made you rich deserve a slightly bigger piece of the action than they got in the 19th century or the early 20th century, or perhaps even a considerably bigger piece of the action. You'll still be the owner, you'll still have the most, you'll still be the big boss, but you won't have people in full-time employment struggling or voting on whether they should eat or heat today. It's not communism, it's not Marxism, I would loosely describe it as Christian democracy. So why do you hate it? 0345 6060 973. And I'm not going to accept the answer because Rupert Murdoch told me to, or because the Daily Mail told me to, or because some tin pot gob on a stick who probably can't even spell most of the issues involved in conversations like this has told you to. The kind of people who are opposed to all strikes, whatever their reasoning and whatever their rationale, except, I imagine, airstrikes. They're usually in favour of airstrikes, those people, but opposed to, obviously, offering sanctuary to refugees fleeing the consequences of those airstrikes. Gosh. Nathan is in Sandwich. Nathan, what is going on?
Hi, Jamie.
Hello.
Pleasure speaking to you.
Oh, we're going to have to do something. I'll give it a second, but the phone line is worrying me. Carry on. Be quick.
Okay. Basically, I think it has something to come down with people just aren't aware or politically active. And for those of us who are, we overestimate this.
This is a very, very pot kettle black of me, but that is quite condescending.
Well, yeah.
And I don't agree with you. There's someone over there who resents that person. Envy is not an absence of critical thinking or an absence of political engagement. Envy is one of the 7 deadly sins.
The opportunity to develop critical thinking skills.
You don't need to.
And this has been exploited by non-dom media owners.
Yeah, I'll agree with the second bit, but you don't need to develop critical thinking skills in an academic sense in order to
I'm not talking academic.
Or any sense. Well, you did say education. So
I didn't say education.
You said a lack of education.
No, I didn't.
Oh, right, my bad. Sorry. I thought you did.
No,
so how do you get these skills then?
That's a good question. Our education system, probably.
Sorry, I read your mind rather than actually repeating your words back to you. That must be very...
I'm talking primary school, secondary school.
That must be very frustrating. But yeah, why shouldn't a railway worker earn 30, 40 grand a year? You don't need critical thinking skills to answer that question dishonestly or honestly. Why shouldn't they? I'm uncomfortable increasingly, and I'm guilty of it myself, mate. So please don't take this as a cutting criticism. We can't just keep saying these people aren't as enlightened or as educated as us. These people aren't as clever as us.
I suppose maybe you're trying to drill down to maybe people just are envious, or it's a natural human instinct.
Well, I'm trying to drill down to what comes first: the appetite or the meal. The serving up
I don't understand that.
The serving up of that's because your critical thinking skills aren't up to sniff, Nathan.
I wasn't educated.
What comes first? The appetite for divisive, often fact-free red meat that encourages you to turn on your neighbour, or the red meat creates the appetite for the divisive rhetoric that encourages you to turn on your neighbour.
How about this? People have hard lives.
Yes.
We're now telling them. I don't know who we is, but they're being told to not like that person over there. They haven't got the time, maybe, to invest in actually research what's going on. And it's just easy. It's convenient. It's Daily Mail headlines in little snippets that people can digest.
Maybe, but I do think it must go a little bit deeper than that, because you're suggesting that if we took away the headlines, then we'd take away that feeling. And I'm not... Maybe I'm more optimistic than you, or more pessimistic than you, actually, as I think it feeds something baser than that, something that is not necessarily created, but which is Fed, I'm not sure. 10:57 is the time. This is nice from Jay. James, I've just devoured the Wes Streeting full disclosure. What a brilliant proper man. We need people like him and Angela Rayner running this country now, not people with so much privilege and zero understanding. And then you talked to me a little bit about your radio listening habits, Jay, which obviously it would be indiscreet and undiplomatic of me to read out on this particular radio station. But I hope you feel seen. Also, that Wes Streeting thing, a little clip of it went up yesterday. If you think I exaggerate about the crossover, just in my own social media experiences, not so much anymore, but certainly until sort of 2019, late 2019, about how close far-right Twitter trolls and, I'm going to say, to be polite, Corbynite Twitter trolls are. Go and have a look at the clip of Wes Streeting and some of the responses, including all the sort of photoshopped jokes with me and Wes in a bath together. You would not be able to guess which has come from the far right and which has come from the kinder, gentler politics camp of the former Labour leader's supporters. And I know, unless you're on Twitter, you don't know this exists. It is literally the only ecosystem in which they're constantly smelling each other's farts. But they do exist, and it's a useful indication, a useful illustration of it today on Twitter. And I'll play you a little clip of that interview. Fascinating politician, Wes Streeting, for a whole heap of reasons, not least his age and his ability to articulate. You may draw comparisons and even contrasts with other prominent Labour politicians. Last word on this. Chris is in Leeds. Chris, what's going on?
Morning, James.
Hello.
I'd just like to say first and foremost that I am in total support of the RMT.
Right.
And I'd like to remind everybody listening.
But it's RMT chiefly, isn't it? Go on.
Yes. And I'd like to remind everybody, as I was saying to your colleague a few moments ago, that everything in this country that workers enjoy now,
yes,
absolutely everything, from the National Health Service to paid holidays and so on and so forth. The list's endless.
It's never given up, is it? It's never just, I wake up this morning and make the life of my workers easier. There are a few exceptions to that. There were a few sort of Victorian entrepreneurs who were altruist, and you look at someone like Timpson today who gives his workers a lot more than he needs to. But on a national level, it's never happened.
Absolutely. Virtually everything that people, that your listeners are listening to, except people that have been born into fabulous wealth, every single thing, social housing and everything, is there because people, trade unions, workers, over the centuries, and the Labour Party in particular, have fought tooth and nail to get them. And people who are dismissive of trade unionism should remember that every day of their lives when they wake up, there's nobody in the world that's no conservative, no capitalist has ever said to anybody, or I should say, with a few exceptions of back in Victorian times,
and today,
but very few people,
and business by business as opposed to a national requirement. Briefly, because you can hear the music dingling in the background, Chris. Why is it so easy to persuade people to punch themselves and their neighbours in the face?
I think this is all because people have been sold this idea that Johnson has given a few more crumbs off the table, and they've convinced themselves because they've got a 3-bedroom semi in Leeds or wherever else. Yeah. And
they're on the same team. This illusion of membership of the owning classes. It's not down to Johnson, although there's a strong argument for claiming that it started in about 1979, which an earlier caller made, actually, also, I think, from Yorkshire. Chris, thank you. It's 11:01. Up next, Julian Assange is to be extradited to America. What do you think of that? 4 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Time for my shameful admission. I have very, very little grasp of the Julian Assange story. I know that Priti Patel has this morning decided to approve his extradition to America, where he faces espionage charges after the UK courts have not found that it would be oppressive, unjust or an abuse to do so. That's a claim from a Home Office spokesperson. And I do know roughly what he did, but it is a huge Achilles heel for me, and I am embarrassed to admit that. Moderately embarrassed because, nobody's perfect, and I'm fairly well informed on a fairly wide array of subjects, but I am embarrassingly ill-informed on this, and I might take a moment to work out why. The journalist I want to talk to is Alan Rusbridger, the former editor of The Guardian, because I think it might be his fault. You'll remember that I've explained to you a few times that I was guilty of that which I now condemn for many years doing this job. That the important thing was to have a strong opinion, and the less important thing was to fully understand where that strong opinion came from. So, it would be, for example, with the obvious horrors of a second ethics advisor resigning from Boris Johnson's government, if you don't ever think much about things, today you'd be desperately trying to come up with ways to pretend that that's not a big deal, just as you desperately tried to come up with ways to pretend that him riding roughshod all the coronavirus laws was not a big deal, and pretending that it's not a big deal that he's lost his own anti-corruption czar, he's lost 2 ethics advisors, he's lost members of his own inner circle, his own brother quit the House of Commons rather than join him in government. I mean, you have all manner. But we know that happens, and America is the best illustration of it, because what you're learning at the January the 6th hearings at the moment is absolutely breathtaking. But I do know that when The Guardian published a lot of the information that Julian Assange had discovered, he was widely regarded as an absolute hero. And then he wasn't. And I think because at the time I was subscribing to this strong opinions are the only ones that matter school of thought, I think I rode away from the story because I found it confusing. I'm a huge admirer of Alan Rusbridger, who has described Julian Assange as a narcissistic egomaniac. But he is also one of the most strident defenders of the WikiLeaks founder. If this extradition that is going ahead now on espionage charges could land him in jail, could land Julian Assange in jail for 175 years. The argument is that America's pursuit of Assange, aided by the British authorities, represents a threat to all journalists. And anyone concerned about defending free speech should be deeply, deeply troubled by what has happened in Priti Patel's Home Office this morning. So my promise to you is that by 12 o'clock today, we will both know a hell of a lot more. If you need help like I do, you may not, in which case I apologise for including you in my own cabal of ignorance. But we will know a hell of a lot more about this story than we do now. And I'm delighted to tell you that Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, when these revelations were published, joins me on the line now. Alan, thank you for your time. I'm sure an awful lot of people are keen to talk to you this morning. Should we just begin with your immediate reaction to the news that Priti Patel has approved Julian Assange's extradition?
Well, I'm not terribly surprised, but I'm disappointed because I think it sets a bad precedent. And I think, to be frank, I think Julian Assange has been in jail for long enough for whatever he did. And I think this sends out a bad signal about the safety and the work of journalists more generally.
Should we go back to 2007 when you started receiving documents and information from Julian Assange, who I think is fairly described as a sort of Uber hacker or the recipient of information from Uber hackers? What was that process like, and how did it come to pass?
Well, Assange was the first of a new breed of people who, as you say, received information in bulk. He was doing a lot of good journalism and revealing wrongs. The most, I think, notable story that he did was the obtaining the video footage from a U.S. helicopter of Reuters journalists being gunned down. And I think the world was shocked by that and thought that this was a legitimate thing to publish. He came to us with a lot of documents that he had got from, now turns out, Chelsea Manning, who was a U.S. Intelligence operative at the front. And we published a small and selective tranche of those emails relating to the Iraq and Afghan war, and then there was a second batch which we called the diplomatic cables.
Just to give people an indication of the sort of footage that you're talking about, and I'll put a trigger warning in place here because it is pretty grim. I'm also going to use a mildly rude word, but The leak that was headlined "Collateral Murder," as you mentioned, showed 2 Apache helicopters attacking buildings in Baghdad in 2007, then closing in on a group of people. Among those people were children and journalists, and one US airman could be heard to say, "Oh yeah, look at those dead bastards." So this was inflammatory stuff that you were publishing and that he was providing to you.
Yeah, that was.
You didn't get that one. You didn't actually get that one, did you? But
no,
that's an example of what
the New Yorker published that.
Yes.
But there were other stories about the mistreatment of people by U.S. troops, and you could see that these stories were embarrassing for America. But then a lot of journalism is embarrassing, but that doesn't mean that it should be suppressed or punished.
The allegation is that some of the revelations that reached the public sphere as a consequence of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange endangered and even killed people.
Well, I don't think that was ever alleged in the trial of Chelsea Manning. I mean, the bit that Julian Assange did that I didn't defend at the time was he subsequently released all of the cables, and the publishers who had been working with him at the time didn't agree with that.
Can you talk me through your personal position on that and why you felt that was unacceptable?
Well, we had spent many months redacting the cables in order to publish the bits that we considered both safe and of public importance. And so we didn't agree with the position of releasing everything. But so, there's no secret that we had differences about that. And it's a long time since I spoke to Julian Assange. But what he's being accused of is espionage. I mean, he's been prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and I don't think what he did was espionage. And I think it raises a fundamental issue of, here is an Australian citizen arrested in the UK for breaking US law. Now, suppose you had an American journalist who had revealed something about, I don't know, the Indian or Pakistani or Israeli nuclear programs and broke what they considered to be their official secrets. Are we now in a world in which anybody, any journalist or in the case of Assange, I suppose we call him a citizen journalist, is arrested and turned over to the country for breaking domestic secrecy laws? I think it doesn't take long to think about that before you think that becomes very problematic.
Well, finally, the sort of British political ecosystem, does this decision change according to who's in the White House? Would your feelings about the extradition, or possibly about Julian Assange's future, be different if Donald Trump was still in the White House? Because, of course, there was that, long after your association with him, there was that 2016 dumping of emails from the Democratic Party and a widespread belief that there were attempts to hinder Hillary Clinton's candidacy.
Yeah, I think it's notable that he wasn't prosecuted for that.
Yes.
That was a different matter altogether, but he wasn't prosecuted for that. And I think it's also notable that the new Australian Prime Minister, Albanese, has been making supportive noises about Assange. So, I think the story has got a long way to play. But he has been in jail in a maximum security prison for 3 years now, since 2019. Before that, he was locked up in the Ecuadorian embassy, or locked himself up in the... and 3 years in a maximum security prison for whatever journalistic crime he is said to have done or not done, I think should be enough.
And a word on why you think Priti Patel has done it?
I imagine it would be too awkward in terms of US-UK relations to deny them.
Alan Rusbridger, many thanks indeed for your time. Someone who was absolutely at the heart of those WikiLeaks revelations, and who was very careful, I should stress, to protect whistleblowers or indeed any sensitive information in the publications that he was involved with. Subsequent to that association, Julian Assange dumped huge amounts of unredacted material that many people have argued. And again, my shameful confession that this is not an area where I'm confident of my own knowledge or memory or even understanding. Many people have argued that it would have endangered Western operatives and allies on the ground. So I'm going to take a bit of a risk now And I'm just going to invite you to ring in and tell me what you think about today's news, if it's a story that you have a better understanding of than I do, if it's something you followed more closely than I have, and if it's something that you feel more strongly about than I do, because I have a feeling, particularly on the last bit of that introduction, I obviously should. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Priti Patel has approved the extradition of Julian Assange to America, where he faces espionage charges that could see him sentenced to up to 175 years in jail. What does that mean to you, and why has it prompted the reaction that you are currently processing? 16 minutes after 11 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. 18 minutes after 11 is the time. So top of the show, top of the hour, we have a guest, which means the churn slots a little later into proceedings. Or sorry, the VIM, the very important monologue. But you are more than welcome to interrupt it, or indeed to dispense with it altogether by bringing your contributions to this conversation and sparing everybody mine. So Julian Assange went from being hero to, if not villain, then certainly a hero of questionable heroism. And I think I understand why. I think it was because he went from being a conduit through which hackers and whistleblowers passed very damaging information to the media. And as part of that process, information was redacted on the grounds, and this is what journalistic judgment would define, on the grounds that some of this information would do enormous harm to either soldiers or spies or operatives loyal to the West, allies, okay? And that makes sense. And then, subsequent to that, he bypassed what we call traditional media and started dumping huge tranches of unredacted, uncensored documents, which didn't entail the exercise of that judgment, that either that journalistic or that diplomatic judgment, in order to keep the stuff out of the public eye that might expose innocent people to new and potentially horrible dangers. Okay, this is my understanding of what has happened, aided in large part by the conversation I've just had with Alan Rusbridger. Then you have this, if you like, well, and of course we haven't even mentioned the sex offences that were alleged to have occurred and that saw him facing extradition charges for a whole different bunch of reasons. But the idea was always, if he was extradited, I think, to Sweden on the sex offence allegations, then his likelihood of being extradited to America became greater. And I think that's why he went into the Ecuadorian embassy, where, I don't know if you remember this, Nigel Farage went to visit him once, because then he became a player in the Donald Trump story with claims that he had released tranches of emails from within the Democratic Party with the intent of damaging Hillary Clinton's candidacy. Again, I'm more than happy to be steered by you on this, on the importance of it, or even the accuracy of what I am describing. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. I think I've got everything right so far. Come April 2019, the political leadership in Ecuador changed, and Julian Assange was essentially slung out of the embassy where Nigel Farage went to visit him. He was arrested, there, by the British police, charged with breaching the 2012 bail terms and sentenced to 50 weeks in prison. He said in court that he did not want to be prosecuted in the US for journalism, in his words, that has won many awards. So the charges include trying to help Chelsea Manning hack into a Pentagon computer. A month later, 17 charges of espionage were added, related to his publications of American actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, which Assange still insists were war crimes. And then you fast forward, I think, to 2016, July, publication of emails hacked from the Democratic Party that revealed top officials had worked to help Hillary Clinton's candidacy and undermine that of Bernie Sanders. So it was a great wedge, a great division tactic for the Democratic Party. It was also alleged that the Russian government obtained the emails, and Donald Trump, of course, often praised WikiLeaks during the 2016 campaign. so you may be doing a slightly better job than I was expecting to, but I get a little bit confused now about what happened in America. The Guardian published a story in 2018 claiming that Paul Manafort, the Trump campaign manager, had visited the WikiLeaks founder at the Ecuadorian embassy. But Assange and Manafort have denied any such meeting, and there's never been photographic or video evidence published to support the claim. We do know that Farage visited him at that embassy because he was photographed coming out with an old pal of mine who was had the unfortunate task of producing that programme on the radio at the time. But whether that was as significant as some people claimed, I genuinely don't know. So let's do the question this way round, okay? Should Britain be extraditing Julian Assange to America? And I want to focus in, if I can, on what Alan Rusbridge has said, because what it means is that a precedent is set. Nothing that was published was untrue, okay? This is crucial. Everything that was reported actually happened. So whether you are unhappy that fractures were introduced into the Democratic Party as a consequence of those leaks, or whether you are unhappy that American patriots took a bit of a kicking on the we've got the right to police the world, or we've got the moral high ground front because they were shown to have committed alleged war crimes. Nothing that happened wasn't true. In fact, I can feel a strong opinion forming as I speak. I think. Tell the truth and shame the devil. It's almost the figure of speech I was looking for. Publish and be damned. If it's the truth, do we have the right to see it? And if you don't think we should have the right to see it, who gets to decide that? The people in charge, who may not want you to see lots and lots of things that you would quite like to see or benefit from knowing, or somebody else? The whistle-blowing, crusading journalist, which is clearly how Julian Assange has often seen himself. He then subsequently, Julie reminds me, got caught up in that conspiracy theory surrounding Seth Rich, the Democratic staffer. So, what do we think? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I don't want any sort of nuttiness or excessive conspiracy theorising, but I do want, very simply, to know how you feel about the British government sending to America to face trial and decades in jail somebody who calls himself a journalist and hasn't published anything that isn't true. 0345 6060 973. Because when I put it like that, I think it's wrong to send him. And I'm very conscious of thinking that Priti Patel is probably the worst politician. Well, she can't be, can she? Because we've got the other one. She's a very bad politician, an awful an appalling politician. So I don't want to just base my response to this upon the fact that it's her what has done it. That would be footballification. I don't, because nothing that was published was untrue. 175 years in jail seems wrong. Some time in jail perhaps seems fair, but which jail, which country, which jurisdiction? I don't know. And I think if I haven't proved it to you already, then when you ring in to educate me on this issue, I will prove conclusively that you probably know more about it than I do. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Is it simplistic to suggest that Julian Assange has incurred the ire of the American political establishment, regardless of, well, Trump being an aberration, as in so many things, by actually publishing evidence of their alleged war crimes? And why do you think Priti Patel's done it this week? Marnaz is in Harrow. Marnaz, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
Lovely to talk to you. I'm
Well,
just
we'll
going
see.
to be short and beneficial and not take anybody's time. I've been working...
Take all the time you want, Marnaz. Take all the time you want.
I've been working with Jeremy Corbyn and all the rest in the case of Julian Assange, and
Yes.
I've been praying for him and all the rest. My point is, A, if they do that, they just completely shut down the right of the journalist. B, they're covering up what he released. It is the truth, for whatever the reason anybody going to think. But truth is the truth. So if you want to jail him, sending over there because we are big, you're small, we are powerful, you're not powerful, that's not going to cover up the truth. Let me just give you one story.
Well, hang on a minute. It's a conversation, not a soapbox. So I do. I mean, does that mean that you believe that we should be free to publish state secrets willy-nilly without any punishment or recourse?
Why is it secret when they're committing the war crime?
No, that's very different. You're saying it's the truth, and therefore it is unquestionable that it should be published. But there are things that are true that would put huge numbers of innocent people in grave danger if they were published.
Who's going to be in great danger?
Some things are secret well, I don't know. You might publish the location of sensitive material or people that foreign countries want to kill.
He didn't do that, did he?
No, but I don't know, you see, Marnaz. Because
I do know.
Well, you don't, because the unredacted stuff contained lots of sensitive information that may have put people in danger. And your point that you opened with was a sort of objective statement about the truth being enough of a defence. And I'm sympathetic to that until I start thinking about it. So if, for example, we have in this country dissidents from deeply oppressive and unpleasant governments, and Julian Assange gets hold of their addresses, do you think he should publish them?
Not their addresses, but he can publish what they do wrong.
They've done nothing wrong. They are dissidents from oppressive, totalitarian governments. No. Again, I'm making it quite. I think I'm making it clear enough. So I'm only going to try once more. I'm just challenging the idea that because something is true, there is no question about the rightness of publishing it. And I'm giving you an example about something that I don't think you would agree should be published, even though it is true.
I don't think what you pointed out is sort of related to Julian Assange.
But your whole point was that because what he published was true, punishment is inappropriate. And I'm merely pointing out that publishing true stuff and thinking of an example that would compel you to agree that sometimes publishing stuff that is true should be punished and should be discouraged. That's all I'm trying to do.
He's already been in jail and he's already been locked up 7 hours. Enough is enough.
Yes, I think that is close to what Alan Rusbridger was saying, and I can line up. So I can line up behind that.
He should not be sent into America. A big no from me and many other people. I'm just going to give
It's not Britain's Got Talent, Marna. It's a big no from you. You'll be reaching for the golden buzzer next.
I'm not in a Britain talent. I'm just talking to James Bryan on a radio.
You are.
And I'm sitting in a car. I have to be somewhere else.
No, well, let me detain you no longer because I'm already ready for the news. And I stress again, I don't want this to be what the word I want? Well, a footballified discussion. And I think there are some very compelling claims that some of the leaks did cause let's just say bad things to happen to people who didn't deserve it. 11:31 is the time, but I stress again, I don't have the ducks in a row that I do on so many other subjects when people ring in to properly challenge or contradict. I just don't know enough about this issue, so bear that in mind and don't take advantage of my good nature. Holly Harris is here now with the headlines. It is 11:34. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I am discussing the imminent, perhaps, extradition of Julian Assange to America, where he faces espionage charges, and the suggestion, a fairly strong suggestion, that this is an appalling affront to press freedom. 26 minutes to 12 is the time. Let's go to Kieran, who's in Dore in the Peak District. Kieran, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James. Nice to speak to you again. Although I can't get this vision of you dressed like the man from Down Monty out of my head, to be honest with you.
If you're in Dublin this weekend, it could be your lucky day. Go on.
I absolutely disagree with this decision.
Yes.
I mean, to be honest with you, you do make a very good point about where do you draw the line. But I think that, if atrocities are being committed, these people do need to be held accountable, particularly what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
They have to. I mean, and
But this is what we're going to call the Rusbridger wriggle kicks in, because he has been punished. No one's suggesting he should not have been punished at all. And Rusbridger published some of the stuff that you describe. But when you get into Nick Cohen's written very persuasively about Assange's condemnations of what he calls the American military-industrial complex, which meant that anybody who had essentially consorted with them, even if they were fighting against the Taliban, their cables with the State Department were fair game. So even the opponents of dictatorial